Billionaire's fiancé poured grease on the maid. The billionaire made sure she regretted it. The coffee was still steaming when it happened. 1 second, Maria Alvarez was standing in the marble hallway of the Whitmore mansion, carrying a silver tray like she had done every morning for 6 years. The next second, hot grease from a pan in the kitchen was flying through the air, thrown by the woman who was about to become the lady of the house. It hit Maria across her arm and her cheek, and she screamed, and the tray crashed to the floor, and for 3 long seconds, nobody in that house moved. If your chest just tightened a little reading that, stay with me, because this story gets a lot bigger before it gets better. And if stories like this, stories about ordinary people getting justice against people who think money makes them untouchable, if stories like that mean something to you, this is exactly the kind of channel you want to be part of. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in the next 20 minutes is going to make you want to tell someone about it. Now let's go back. Let's understand who these people really were before that pan of hot grease ever left Vanessa Calloway's hand. Richard Whitmore was 58 years old, and he had built an empire out of shipping and logistics that stretched across 3 continents. He was not a flashy man. He wore the same 3 gray suits on rotation, drove himself to work most days, and still remembered the names of every person who had worked for him for more than a year. His late wife, Elinor, had died of cancer 9 years earlier, and something in Richard had gone quiet after that. He worked. He provided for his daughter, Sophie, who was away at university in Boston. And he told himself that love, real love, the kind that fills up a house, was something that belonged to his past. Then he met Vanessa Calloway. She was 34, beautiful in the way that magazine covers are beautiful, sharp-tongued, quick with a compliment, and always aware of exactly who was in the room and how much they were worth. She had grown up with old money that had quietly disappeared by the time she turned 25, leaving her with expensive taste and no way to pay for it. When she met Richard at a charity gala, something in her calculated very fast. Here was a lonely, grieving, generous man with more money than he could ever spend. Within 8 months, there was a ring on her finger, a rock so large it looked almost silly on her thin hand, and a wedding date set for the spring. Richard believed with his whole heart that he had found love again. He believed it because he wanted to believe it so badly that he stopped looking for the cracks. But the staff saw the cracks. They always do. Maria Alvarez had worked in that house since Elinor was still alive. She was 51 years old, a widow herself, with 2 grown children and a granddaughter she adored more than anything in this world. She had immigrated from Guatemala 30 years earlier, worked 3 jobs to put herself through night classes, and eventually found her way into housekeeping for the Whitmore family. Elinor had treated her like family. Richard trusted her with the keys to every room in that mansion. Maria was not just staff. She was, in every way that mattered, part of that household's soul. To understand why this story matters so much, you have to understand what that house meant to Richard. After Elinor passed, Richard had kept every routine exactly the same, almost like the house itself was a memory he refused to let fade. Maria was part of that routine. She knew that Richard liked his coffee black on weekdays and with a little cream on Sundays, a habit from years of Elinor teasing him about it. She knew which room still held Elinor's reading chair untouched, and she dusted it every week without ever being asked, because she understood, in the quiet way that people who truly pay attention understand things, that some grief needs to be respected rather than tidied away. Richard never had to explain any of this to her. She simply knew, because she had been there, present and steady, through every hard year. So when Vanessa entered that house, she was not just entering Richard's life. She was entering a delicate, carefully protected world that Maria had helped hold together in silence for nearly a decade. Vanessa hated her from the very first week. It wasn't loud at first. It was small things. Vanessa would speak to Maria slowly and too simply, the way some people speak to someone they've already decided is beneath them, even though Maria's English was better than Vanessa's own grammar most days. Vanessa would leave messes specifically for Maria to clean, watching her do it with a small, satisfied smile. She made comments, quiet ones, the kind designed so that if you repeated them back, they'd sound almost innocent. "I just don't understand why people like her get hired for houses like this," she said once to a friend on the phone, not bothering to lower her voice while Maria dusted the next room. "There's a reason people like that stay in service their whole lives." Maria heard every word. She said nothing. She had a mortgage. She had a granddaughter who needed braces. She had learned over 51 years of living in this country that sometimes silence was the only armor you could afford. But here's something you need to understand about people like Vanessa Calloway, and if you've lived a while, if you've watched the world turn for a few decades like our audience has, you already know this in your bones. Cruelty that gets away with small things does not stay small. It grows. It gets hungrier. And it was only a matter of time before it grew into something that could not be ignored. That morning, the morning with the grease, Vanessa had woken up in a foul mood. The wedding planner had told her that the venue she wanted for the ceremony was already booked for another couple that same weekend, a couple who had reserved it a full year earlier. Vanessa did not take rejection well. She stormed through that house looking for somewhere to put her anger, and Maria, carrying a breakfast tray toward the dining room, walked directly into her path. "Move," Vanessa snapped. Maria stepped aside, careful not to spill the coffee. "You people are always in the way," Vanessa muttered, loud enough to be heard. Something in Maria, 51 years of swallowed words, almost answered back. She didn't. She kept walking toward the kitchen, and that should have been the end of it. But Vanessa followed her into the kitchen, where a pan of oil was still hot on the stove from breakfast preparation, and the argument, because it did become an argument, a short and ugly one, about a stain Vanessa claimed Maria had left on a blouse, escalated in a way that no one in that kitchen expected. Vanessa's hand closed around the handle of that pan, and in one furious motion she threw its contents across the room. Maria's scream brought 3 other staff members running. It brought the head housekeeper, who immediately called for ice and clean towels. And it brought Richard Whitmore himself, who had been in his study 2 floors up and heard the commotion through an open window. He arrived to find Maria sitting on a kitchen stool, her arm red and blistering, her hands shaking, tears streaming down a face that had not cried in front of this family in 6 years. And he found Vanessa standing over her, not comforting her, not apologizing, but complaining that the whole thing was completely overblown and that Maria was being dramatic. If you've ever watched someone reveal exactly who they are in a single moment, you know that feeling, the floor tilting slightly beneath you, the sudden clarity that replaces months of doubt. That was the moment for Richard Whitmore. Now I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine spending 9 years grieving, 9 years convincing yourself you'd never feel whole again, and then finally letting yourself hope, only to discover the person you gave that hope to is capable of this. Stay with me here because this story is about to test what real strength looks like, and there is a lot more coming. If this kind of justice, the kind where cruelty finally meets its match, gets your blood moving even a little, subscribe now. You will not want to miss where this goes. Richard did not raise his voice. That was the thing about him, the angrier he got, the quieter he became. He knelt beside Maria first. He asked if she was in pain. He personally called his own doctor, not the household physician, but a specialist he trusted with his life, and had her sent to the hospital in his private car within 4 minutes. He held her hand as they walked her out, and he told her in front of everyone, "Maria, you are not going anywhere. This is not your fault, and I need you to hear that clearly before anything else is said today." Only then did he turn to Vanessa. "Get your things together," he said. "You'll be staying at the Regency Hotel tonight." Vanessa laughed, an actual laugh, sharp and disbelieving. "Richard, don't be ridiculous. It was an accident. She startled me." "I watched the security footage while you were still talking," Richard said. And that was true. There were cameras in that kitchen, quiet ones installed after a break-in scare years earlier, and the head housekeeper had already pulled up the footage on her phone. Richard had seen it in real time, standing in the doorway. He had seen Vanessa pick up that pan and throw it with the deliberate motion of someone releasing rage, not someone flinching in surprise. "It wasn't an accident," he said, "and I think somewhere in you know that." Now here is where the story deepens, because Richard Whitmore was not a man who acted purely on impulse, even when his heart was breaking all over again. That night, after Maria had been treated and released, thankfully with only minor burns, though the emotional wound would take much longer to heal, Richard sat alone in his study and did something he had never done before in 8 months of dating Vanessa Calloway. He called in a private investigator. Not to spy, not out of paranoia, but because a small, cold voice in the back of his mind, the same voice that had built an empire by knowing when something didn't add up, told him that a woman capable of that kind of cruelty in a moment of anger had probably shown that cruelty before, to people with even less power to speak up than Maria had. He was right. Over the next 10 days, the investigator uncovered a pattern that made Richard's stomach turn. a former housekeeper at Vanessa's family estate, let go years earlier after Vanessa accused her, falsely. It turned out of theft, simply because the young woman had questioned one of Vanessa's demands. A nanny hired briefly 2 years before Richard met Vanessa, who quit after just 11 days and later told a friend. In a message, the investigator obtained legally through public records and voluntary interviews that Vanessa had treated her like she wasn't a real person. A waitress at a restaurant Vanessa frequented who remembered being screamed at and called names in front of a full dining room over a mistaken order. Names that had nothing to do with the mistake, and everything to do with where that waitress's family came from. A pattern, not a single bad moment, a pattern. And there was one more detail the investigator found, one that Richard would carry with him for the rest of his life. Years earlier, before Vanessa's family lost their fortune, there had been a housekeeper in her childhood home named Rosa, a woman who had practically raised Vanessa while her own parents traveled for months at a time. When the family's money disappeared and they could no longer afford staff, Rosa was let go with a single week's notice and no severance after 18 years of service. A neighbor who still remembered the family told the investigator that 17-year-old Vanessa had not said a single word of goodbye to the woman who had packed her lunches, nursed her through chickenpox, and sat with her through countless nights when her parents were somewhere else in the world. It made Richard wonder, quietly and sadly, whether Vanessa's cruelty wasn't only about looking down on people, but also about something colder underneath it, a kind of person who had learned early that the people who loved you the most could simply be discarded once they stopped being useful. It didn't excuse anything, but it helped Richard understand exactly what kind of person he had almost spent the rest of his life with. Now I want to ask you something, and think about this honestly for a second, because I think our viewers, people who have lived long enough to really see how the world works, already know the answer. Have you ever met someone like this? Someone who is perfectly charming to people they think matter, and perfectly cruel to people they think don't. If that description makes your jaw tighten a little, you understand exactly why what happens next in this story matters so much. And if you want more stories like this one, stories where people like Vanessa finally face what's coming to them, subscribe now, because we have so many more of these waiting for you. Richard confronted Vanessa with all of it 3 days later, in a private meeting at his lawyer's office, not because he needed an audience, but because he wanted witnesses who could not be argued with or charmed. He laid out every incident. He laid out the security footage from his own kitchen, and he watched, almost sadly, as Vanessa's careful mask cracked completely. She didn't cry, she didn't apologize. She got angry, genuinely, coldly angry, and said something that Richard would remember for the rest of his life. You think you're better than me because you were born rich too, Richard? The only difference between us is that I'm honest about what I want. No, Richard said quietly. The difference between us, Vanessa, is that I would never in my life pour anything hot on another human being and then complain that they were being dramatic about it. The engagement ended that afternoon. The ring, the enormous, gleaming ring that had once seemed to promise a whole new chapter of Richard's life, was returned, though not before Vanessa tried, unsuccessfully, to claim it as a gift she was legally entitled to keep. Richard's lawyers made quick work of that claim. There is something deeply satisfying about watching a person who thought they had outsmarted everyone discover very suddenly that they had not. But Richard was not finished, because ending the engagement was justice for himself. It was not yet justice for Maria. He sat with Maria personally in his study 2 days after the incident, and he asked her, really asked her, the way you ask someone whose answer actually matters to you, what she needed. Not what he thought she should have, what she needed. Maria, through tears, she finally allowed herself to cry in front of him, told him the truth. She told him about 30 years of working twice as hard to be seen as equal. She told him about swallowing insults so her children could have a stable home. She told him that what hurt more than the burn on her arm was the years of small cruelties that had led up to that moment, cruelties that everyone around her had noticed, and no one, until now, had stopped. Richard listened to every word without interrupting. And here's what I want you to hold on to, because this is the heart of this entire story. This is the moment where a good man decides that being good is not enough, that being good means actually doing something. Richard did not just fire Vanessa from his life. He built something out of what happened to Maria. He established within that same month a fund at his company specifically for household and service staff, covering medical care, education for their children, and legal protection against exactly the kind of mistreatment Maria had endured for years without anyone in power ever asking if she was okay. He named it, simply the Alvarez Fund with Maria's permission, so that her name would forever be attached not to the day she was hurt, but to the day things finally changed for people like her. If you're feeling something right now, that warm, fierce feeling of watching wrong finally being made right, that is exactly the feeling this channel exists to give you, over and over again. That's 4 times now I've asked, and I promise you this is the last one for this video. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because the next story might be even more powerful than this one, and you will not want to miss it landing in your feed. News of what happened did not stay quiet for long. Household staff talked to each other. Word reached other families in that same social circle, families who employed housekeepers, nannies, drivers, groundskeepers, and Vanessa Calloway found, very quickly, that the doors that money and beauty had once opened for her were now closing, one by one. She was disinvited from a charity board she had once chaired. Old friends stopped returning her calls. The story, quietly at first and then not so quietly, made its way into a gossip column, then a local news segment about the price of cruelty in high society, featuring, with her permission and her face gently blurred for privacy, though her story told in full, an interview with a woman named Maria, who spoke about dignity, and about how one man's decision to actually listen had changed the rest of her life. There is something almost poetic about how quickly a reputation built on other people's silence can collapse the moment that silence ends. For years, Vanessa had counted on the fact that people like Maria, like the nanny who quit after 11 days, like the waitress who was humiliated in front of a full restaurant, would simply absorb what happened to them and move on, too afraid or too tired to speak up. She had never once imagined that all those small, separate silences could one day be gathered together by a man with the resources and the will to finally connect them. That was her real mistake, not the pan of hot oil, though that was the moment that broke everything open, but the years of quiet cruelty she assumed would never catch up with her. Vanessa Calloway left the city 18 months later. Some said she moved to Florida. Some said Arizona. It didn't matter, really. What mattered was that the woman who once believed that a person's worth could be measured by their bank account, and where their family came from, had learned, in the harshest way possible, that the world does not actually work that way, not in any way that lasts. Maria stayed with the Whitmore family for another 11 years, until she chose to retire at 62. Surrounded by a family that had, by then, truly become her own. Richard walked her granddaughter down the aisle at her wedding years later, standing in for the grandfather the girl had never known. Maria's arm healed completely, though a faint mark remained, a small pale scar she would sometimes touch without thinking, not with sadness anymore, but almost like a reminder of the exact moment her life had quietly, permanently changed for the better. And Richard didn't marry again for a long time. But when he finally did, years later, it was to a woman his own daughter introduced him to, a schoolteacher. Warm and unremarkable in the way that truly good people often are. Someone who treated every person in every room, from the CEO to the person clearing the plates, with exactly the same respect. At their small wedding, held in the garden of that same mansion, there was one guest who insisted on being there despite Richard's gentle protest that she should simply relax and enjoy herself as a guest of honor. Maria stood near the front, in a beautiful blue dress she had bought specially for the occasion, and when Richard caught her eye during his vows, he paused for just a second and mouthed 2 words across the crowd: "Thank you." Because sometimes the people who teach us the most about what real love and real strength look like are not the people we chose to marry. Sometimes they are the people who were quietly there all along, holding a household and a family's dignity, together, one difficult, unglamorous day at a time. This is a story about a single terrible moment, but it's really a story about what happens after that moment, about the difference between people who look away from cruelty because it's easier, and people who look straight at it and decide, once and for all, that it stops here. Richard Whitmore didn't just protect Maria. He changed, permanently, the way he saw the world, and the way his entire company treated the people who kept it running. If this story moved you even a little, if you found yourself hoping, all the way through, that Maria would get the justice she deserved, that's exactly why stories like this matter, and exactly why we tell them. Somewhere out there right now, there is a Maria in someone's household, in someone's office, in someone's life, being treated as less than she is. And somewhere out there, hopefully, there is a Richard too, someone paying close enough attention to notice, and brave enough to finally do something about it. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe, tell us in the comments what part of this story hit you the hardest, and we'll see you in the next one.